And here we go again. Welcome back, Rhetorical Rockstars. This is the fourth of four preparation and review materials presentations that I've done on argumentation. So today we're going to be covering something that's a little bit fun, at least to me, and that, well, all argumentation is fun to me, but this is kind of the icing on the cake, and that is logical fallacies. So I want to warn you that this can be tricky and you can get bogged down in it and you could go on forever and ever and ever. So I'm going to try to keep it as succinct as possible. I know that the last couple of videos were a little bit long, but also give you kind of a view of like how this applies to argumentation. So remember, we've already covered the basics of argumentation. We've developed claims, and we've talked about how to use evidence. But even within that use of evidence, we have to be careful of these logical fallacies. So that's what we'll be talking about in this video. As with all the other videos, this is drawn from our textbook for the class, The Language of Composition, Reading, Writing, and Rhetoric, as well as some of my own observations and ideas thrown in there. So let's get started. First of all, I want to go over just the basics of logical fallacies. You need to understand that there's lots to explore here. Again, we could go on and on and on, and I'm going to try not to do that. So some of the basic things that you need to understand about a logical fallacy is just what a logical fallacy is. And that is that a logical fallacy is a vulnerability, a weakness, or a breakdown in the logic of your reasoning. Essentially what that means is that you have a conclusion that doesn't follow from your reasoning. That at some point there's this break. You reason through, you've elaborated on your evidence maybe, but then the way that you tie your evidence back to your claim or back to your conclusion just doesn't make sense. And sometimes it's obvious why it doesn't make sense, and other times it's not as obvious as for why it doesn't make sense. Oftentimes, logical fallacies kind of go hidden. So, how do you need to think about logical fallacies? Number one is that they're inescapable. We commit them all the time. Everybody does them. And we have to not be able to necessarily get rid of them entirely, but we have to accept that logical fallacies exist and we have to be able to work around them. We also need to understand that other people, when we're talking rhetorically, can either deliberately or ignorantly use them in manipulative or deceptive ways for their audience. So the thing is about logical fallacies is that a lot of times they can be used in really effective ways to get people to think or do or say or believe the things that you're trying to get them to think or do or say or believe. However, that doesn't mean that it's right. So they can be used deceptively, and we have to, part of our responsibility is to make sure that we aren't using them deceptively, but that we're not allowing other people to use them deceptively as well. So we accept that they exist, but we don't accept that they should be left to lie and just ignored. Third, then we have to think about how can we use them responsibly, because this is a rhetoric class and you may use them from time to time on purpose. If you're going to do that, how are you going to do that responsibly? First of all, it's your job to look at somebody else's argument and be able to identify the weak points of their argument. And if you can do that by identifying logical fallacies in their argument, then that's going to hold them accountable. Uh, Second is you can plug holes in your own argument by knowing where you're using a logical fallacy. If you notice, oh, I used this logical fallacy here or there, then you can address that and and hopefully be able to explain why your argument is still legitimate despite the fact that it has a logical fallacy in it. And then third, you can expose the weaknesses of counter-arguments as well, because often counter-arguments are where people do something called motivated reasoning. If you've argued effectively against them, they're not gonna want to abandon their side. So a lot of times the reason that they'll come up with in their counter-argument will be will possess at least one, if not multiple, logical fallacies, in which case, if you're familiar with the logical fallacies, you can help them break down the weaknesses of their arguments. So with all of that out of the way, let's take a few looks at some of the basic logical fallacies. So these are just a few examples, and you're going to look at this list and you're going to say, that's just a few. The reality is, yes, there are tons of logical fallacies. I am going to go over the ones that appeared in the textbook and the ones that tend to be more common. What I want you to remember is that you're going to be given, a lot of information here, but in the case of logical fallacies, the concept of the logical fallacy is much more important than the term. So if you can't remember what is this logical fallacy called, what is that logical fallacy called, it's probably fine. What's more important is that you understand what makes it a logical fallacy, the idea behind it. Forget about the term. If you know that what they're doing is a logical fallacy, you'll be fine. So I've broken these down, thanks to the textbook, in terms of 3 categories. The first category is logical fallacies of relevance. So, what would make a piece of evidence and its elaboration irrelevant? And the first one that I want to talk about is what we call a red herring. So the red herring fallacy is when you skip to a new or irrelevant topic. We've all heard people do this in their arguments. Teenagers tend to do it a lot when they'll grab onto something that somebody says. The adult is trying to make a relevant point, but the teenager will grasp onto the, one little nitpick and kind of go off on a tangent. Those tangents are red herrings. They're intended to distract from the topic in order to weaken the other side's argument, or to just kind of make the other side completely, distract the other side to get them off topic and not be able to make an effective argument. So that's number one. The second one that I want to go over is ad hominem. And ad hominem is a Latin term that I don't know exactly what it means because I don't speak Latin, but we know that homin means human, and it means the attack of the character of the speaker. It's an attack on a human, an attack on a person. So you're attacking a person's character rather than the actual issue that's at hand. If your parent is arguing that you need to be home for curfew at 10 o'clock, and you say, gosh, Mom, you're so stupid. I can't believe that you would make me come home at 10 o'clock. That's an attack that has complete irrelevance to the argument that the mother is making, right? So that's an ad hominem argument. The third fallacy that I want you to be aware of is the faulty analogy. So where we're focusing on irrelevant similarities between two things or two topics. Sorry, there was a little pause there. An excellent way for me to describe a faulty analogy is when we're looking at an advertisement. Say you've got a celebrity who's wearing a specific brand, then we're basically assuming that the brand is good because the celebrity is wearing it, right? So we're drawing this analogy between, the brand is to the celebrity as this brand will be to me. It has nothing to do with the quality. So it's this irrelevant similarity between, the celebrity and the quality of the brand. It means nothing, right? Or it doesn't technically mean anything. So anytime that you're attributing one thing to an irrelevant aspect of another thing, then that's a faulty analogy. Third, post hoc ergo propter hoc. It basically means one thing doesn't follow the other. So claiming that one thing causes another thing because of correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. You can see this when people make let's say they have like a lucky talisman or something. So the baseball pitcher claims that the reason that he pitched such a good game was because he was wearing his lucky purple socks, and therefore, from now on he has to wear his lucky purple socks in order to pitch good games. That's a post hoc ergo propter hoc analogy, fallacy. Obviously the socks have nothing to do with it, but he has inaccurately drawn that logical conclusion. Fifth, the appeal to false authority, which means citing a non-expert as an expert. This is similar to the example that I gave you in the faulty analogy, where the celebrity is being looked at as, adding quality to a brand. That could also be seen as an appeal to false authority. What authority does Michael Jordan have to sell you underwear? Well, none, really. He has authority to teach you basketball, right? But not to sell you underwear. So be careful of looking to people who, a dentist shouldn't be giving you psychological advice, right? Both the dentist and a psychologist are going to have some medical knowledge, but a dentist is not the type of doctor who should be giving you that kind of advice, right? So that's another way that false authority can be appealed to. If you said, this dentist is a doctor, this doctor says this, this is important. Well, yeah, true, but not the right kind of doctor, right? So that's the wrong kind of authority. Lastly, with fallacies of relevance, I want to go over the bandwagon fallacy, which is another one that teenagers are going to be very familiar with. And that is that when everyone believes something, so it must be right. When you're, if you're just saying, well, they did it, this is well, if your friends jumped off a bridge, would you jump too, right? That's pointing out the bandwagon fallacy in someone's logic. So those are fallacies of relevance. The next category are fallacies of relevancy. Sorry, I said fallacies of I think I said relevancy, but I meant accuracy. So how do these fallacies affect accuracy? We've got the straw man fallacy, which is a deliberately bad or oversimplified example of something. So one of the examples that could be given of this is if there's a person who's in favor of abortion, say, and another person is arguing against that person's stance on abortion, that person might say, "Oh, so you're in favor of killing human beings." That's a deliberately bad or oversimplified example. Obviously, a person who is in favor of abortion isn't necessarily in favor of killing all human beings, or even in favor of killing human beings in general, depending on the definition of human beings. So using that is a straw man fallacy. And then we've got this other false dilemma fallacy, in which we oversimplify the argument into black and white or extreme options with no gray area. You're either in favor of abortion or you're against abortion. There's no middle ground. Well, we know that there probably is middle ground. Maybe you're in favor of abortions in some respects and not other respects, or in this case and not in that case, just to use that as an example. So creating a false dilemma is also a fallacy of accuracy, because you're failing to notice the nuance of the situation and of the evidence. Finally, we have fallacies of insufficiency. And before we go on, I want to point out that relevance, accuracy, and insufficiency correlate with the way that we should be thinking of evidence. So that's important for you to probably go back and maybe review. But if we're talking about fallacies of insufficiency, then we've got a couple of examples. So first of all, we've got a hasty generalization where you don't have enough evidence to support a conclusion, where you're just, and this gets back to that sufficiency question, right? There simply isn't enough there to allow you to claim that or to allow you to say that your claim is proved. I'm not going to give an example. Well, actually, I can give an example. So, claiming that it snows, it was cold one day in January and snowed, doesn't disprove climate change, right? It just means it was cold one day. You're generalizing too much over one small piece of evidence. And the second um, fallacy of insufficiency that I want you to be aware of is circular reasoning. And this is a problem that a lot of people run into when they struggle to elaborate on a piece of evidence, where they'll just repeat the claim or they'll repeat a piece of evidence and they'll just kind of rephrase it but not say anything new about it, rather than analyzing a piece of evidence for its function and application. So this goes back to what I was saying about how do you prove the relevance of a piece of evidence. Then if you're able to say this is what this piece of evidence is functioning as, or how it's functioning, and this is how it applies to my claim, then you're more likely to have a sufficient piece of evidence, whereas otherwise it's probably insufficient or irrelevant. So consider all of these fallacies as you develop your ability to work with arguments, both in looking at other people's arguments as well as looking at and developing your own arguments, which we will be practicing in the future.